Good morning and welcome everyone to today's webinar on procurement standards in the Uniform Guidance. I'm so glad you could all join us today to hear this very important presentation about some recent updates to the Uniform Guidance affecting procurement. I'm Amy Miller, the Federal Grants Administrator for the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, or OPR. And here to present today is Karen Norris from Kanoko Consulting. We are recording today's webinar, and the video and the slide presentation will both be available on the OPR website for you to review or share with your colleagues. Throughout the presentation, please enter any questions that you might have in the Questions tab, and we will set aside time at the end for Q&A. We will not be using the chat box today, so please use the Questions tab instead. Before we get started with Karen's presentation, I'd like to let you know about some of the federal grant resources available on the OPR website at opr.ca.gov. You can find all of these resources by clicking the link for federal assistance, which you can find under the CEQA and State Clearinghouse tab. The State Clearinghouse at OPR is California's single point of contact for the intergovernmental review of federal programs. The Applying for Federal Grants link that you see highlighted here is where you'll go when you're applying for a federal grant and need to submit notice of your application to comply with the Executive Order on Intergovernmental Review. That'll take you to this page where you will submit your information along with a PDF of the SF 424 Federal Grant Cover Sheet. All notices can be viewed on this page under the Submissions tab. If you would like to receive notifications of federal grant applications submitted in your area, you can do so under the Registration tab. And then back here on this page, the Federal Grant Resources link highlighted here will take you to a library of information to help you learn more about applying for and managing grants. And it also includes links to the grants pages of every federal agency. This is also where we will post the links for the slides and recording from today's presentation under the Events and Trainings tab. Last is our Federal Grants e-list, which hopefully most of you already receive, but if not, you can sign up for it here. This weekly email provides updates on federal grant opportunities, news, trainings, and events. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to our presenter, Karen Norris. Karen is a nationally recognized expert in the grants community based in the Washington, D.C. area. She regularly presents at state and national conferences and has provided expert testimony about federal grants to the Maryland General Assembly and the United States Senate Subcommittee on Federal Financial Management. And we're very pleased to have her here with us today. So thank you, Karen.
Thanks, Amy. It's great to be here again. To deliver the webinar, and I'm hoping you can hear the audio okay. Today's webinar is about procurement standards, and it's not one that has lots of bells and whistles, but it's a very important process, because once you receive your funding, you're going to spend your funding. And whenever you spend your funding under your awarded grant or cooperative agreement, you need to follow the procurement standards. So let's look at what the learning objectives say. We're going to first of all talk a little bit about the difference between a contract and financial assistance. And the financial assistance awards are your grants and cooperative agreements, as opposed to the contracts. We want to try to develop a greater understanding of the actual procurement provisions, the standards that are in the Uniform Guidance, and then we'll talk about some of the challenges with procurement, and we'll have time at the end for any Q&A. So, a few words. Procurement under the Uniform Guidance more closely follows language from prior OMB Circular A102, which was designed for states, rather than OMB Circular A110, which was for hospitals, nonprofits, and universities. Now, those of you who are new to the grant profession may not realize that we used to follow 8 different OMB circulars when we were administering our grants. And when the uniform guidance was created and made effective for everybody in December of 2014, they merged the 8 prior circulars into this one guidance, the uniform guidance. And it's more uniform than it used to be. It's not quite as uniform as we would hope in some instances, but depending upon the type of non-federal entity you were, when we were following the OMB circulars, you would either follow this circular or you would follow that circular. Everyone didn't follow all 8 circulars. They followed the circulars that applied to the type of non-federal entity. So A110 was a really big circular, big in that it affected a lot of different non-federal entities. Hospitals, nonprofits, and all institutions of higher ed. That's a lot of non-federal entities. And the states would follow A102. Well, A102 had more restrictive language in it than A110. So the language in the uniform guidance reflects the greater restrictions that were in A102. And as a result, when the uniform guidance was first implemented, there was an outcry in the grant community. Oh, we don't like these. This new procurement, we can't deal with this. And there was a 3-year grace period for non-federal entities to get used to the procurement. And now the uniform guidance has since been revised, and some of the procurement provisions have also been revised. So non-federal entities really had to work to adjust to the new standards. And one of the requirements in the uniform guidance is that each non-federal entity has written local policies and procedures for procurement. And so now the written policies and procedures had to be updated to align with the new procurement standards when the uniform guidance was first released. And now that it has been revised again, your current local policies and procedures may need to be updated once again. And then challenges with procurement are among the top 10 audit findings. It's just people have a hard time with it. So with that said, let's start. And let's first of all, what's the difference between a contract award and a financial assistance award? So these definitions are in the uniform guidance, and there used to be 99 definitions in the uniform guidance, and they all had a different provision number, 201, 200.2. So 200.1 through 99 were where all the definitions were. And with the newly revised uniform guidance, it made it impossible for OMB to add or remove any of these definitions with that numbering system. So now all of the definitions are labeled with 200.1. They all have the same number, and this way OMB can add or remove different definitions, and they're all there but alphabetically listed with the same number. So we have contract is defined, cooperative agreement, grant agreement, and subaward. Oops, we skipped. So contract, and the number would be 200.1. You can have contracts and contract awards that are separate and apart. You think of all the Defense Department contracts, to purchase missiles and tanks. But you can also have contracts within a grant. And generally those contracts that are within grants are procurement contracts. The recipient needs to buy something in order to implement the grant program. They need to buy supplies, or they need to buy buy computer equipment, or if it's a Homeland Security grant, maybe they're buying protective equipment, personal equipment, or a fire grant, it might be fire trucks. So you can have contracts within a grant or cooperative agreement, and they're generally procurement contracts. And this is the definition within the uniform guidance. So within the context, within the grant or the cooperative agreement, a contract is a legal instrument by which a recipient or a subrecipient non-federal entity is going to purchase something. You're going to purchase property, you're going to purchase services that are needed to carry out the program under the federal award. And the contractor is an entity that receives the contract. For those of you who've been working in the grant business for a while, contractors used to be called vendors, but now they're called contractors. A cooperative agreement, and notice it's the same provision number, is a legal instrument of financial assistance from a federal awarding agency. And 31 of the U.S. Code sections 6302 to 6305 is the citation. I like to include citations in all of my webinars so that if you need additional information, you have the citation to reference. So the cooperative agreement award is used to enter into a relationship between the non-federal entity and the federal agency to carry out a public purpose. And again, there's the definition under this Title 31 of the U.S. Code. And its purpose is not just to acquire property or services. You're not buying stuff for your own benefit. You are receiving the funds in order to go out and work in the greater public good. And a cooperative agreement would require substantial involvement between the awarding agency and the recipient. Now, a grant agreement is an older award, and it's very similar to a cooperative agreement. They're both financial assistance agreements, both under the same title in the U.S. Code. And again, it's used to enter into a relationship between the federal agency and the recipient entity to carry out a public purpose that's authorized by the law, and not just to acquire property and services for the entity's direct benefit or use. Now, the grant is a little bit different from a cooperative agreement because there's more back and forth. There's more involvement between the recipient and the federal agency with a cooperative agreement than with a grant. And a subaward agreement is a legal instrument of financial assistance. Again, it's financial assistance. It's a grant or a cooperative agreement provided by a pass-through entity like a state. The state will receive funds from the federal government, and then the state will make subawards to its school districts or to its counties to carry out a public good. And so the state will make a subaward. It's not a contract, it's a subaward because they're working on a program or they're working on research. Something is being developed for the greater public good. So contracts and financial assistance awards are sometimes confusing. It's sometimes hard to tell the difference because they share attributes. They're very similar in some regards, so that makes it difficult to distinguish between them. So for instances, they both have terms and conditions that they have to follow. They're both subject to federal requirements. They're usually competitively awarded, although you can have some grants and some contracts that are sole source, but typically they're competitively awarded. They're based on a solicitation and a review of the selection criteria. They're both offered to eligible applicants, and they're both awarded to responsible parties. So they share a lot of similarities. I'm waiting for the slide to advance. There we go. So some of the key attributes of a contract is, well, the contract doesn't work toward a public good. There's no program statute. There's an appropriation, we have money and we can hire you, but there's no particular program statute. So it's strictly a buyer-seller relationship. There'll be terms and deliverables, like for the money that you're paying us, there's your consideration. We will deliver to you the computer equipment that you've ordered. There are signatures and acceptance of the terms, and basically contracts will serve as procurement agreements for purchases of goods and services within the grant. But the contractor's not going to go make any decision about how that grant program is going to be awarded. The contractor has a very limited scope. You ordered these goods, I will deliver them. And that's about it. So when you have a contract, a procurement contract, for example, underneath a grant, there's this issue of applicability. What requirements apply? So contracts usually awarded by federal agencies will follow the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the FAR, where grants and cooperative agreements, which are financial assistance awards, will follow the uniform guidance. So the FAR and the uniform guidance are kind of a parallel universe. Two sets of regulations. One set, the FAR, governs contracts, federally awarded contracts, and the other, the uniform guidance, is for federally awarded grants or cooperative agreements. Contracts, though, awarded within grants could follow either the FAR or the uniform guidance. So a decision needs to be made. How do you want to handle it? If you're the recipient and you're purchasing something under your grant and you're going to have a procurement contract, what are you going to do? Are you going to have them follow the uniform guidance? Are you going to have them follow the FAR? So the applicability provision in the uniform guidance says, well, you can have them follow the uniform guidance if you want to. It may apply to for-profits. Generally, for-profits will receive contracts, and nonprofits or states or, institutions of higher ed will receive grants or cooperative agreements. So the for-profits who usually receive contracts are usually more familiar with the FAR, and they may prefer to follow the FAR. But then it means that you, as the recipient, would have two sets of guidelines that you need to follow, because you've received the grant or the cooperative agreement, so you have to follow the uniform guidance. If you have to follow the uniform guidance, you may just want, no matter what the contractor would prefer, you may want the contractor just to follow the uniform guidance too. And you can do that according to this applicability provision in the uniform guidance. You can make your require that your contractors within the grant also have to follow the uniform guidance. And some may object, but you need to make it clear in your award terms and conditions. Whatever you decide, whether you will have them follow the FAR or you will have them follow the uniform guidance, you should make it clear in the award for that contract what they have to follow. You must follow the uniform guidance, in other words. In addition to just the uniform guidance and the FAR in general, there are also different sets of cost principles, and you would also need to indicate in your award terms and conditions what they're following. And if you want them to follow the uniform guidance, then they would also follow the uniform guidance cost principles, which are in subpart E. If you're going to allow those contractors to follow the FAR, then you also have to become familiar with the FAR cost principles, which would be at 48 CFR Part 31.2. It's in a different section of the CFR. The uniform guidance is at Title II CFR Part 200. And then hospitals have an exception. They follow the uniform guidance, but they have their own set of cost principles. They have to follow the cost principles under Health and Human Services. So the award agreement needs to indicate which cost principles apply. And if you are having your contractors follow the uniform guidance, they would also follow the uniform guidance cost principles. So that's the main decision that needs to happen before you issue the contract, before you start implementing your grant or the contract. Which set of guidance do you want your contractors to follow? And most people say, well, let's keep it as simple as possible so we don't have to have a whole different set of guidelines. Let's make them follow the uniform guidance. Now, I cannot give you legal advice. That would be, when you're talking about award agreements, that's a legal document. So you would want to take this information and treat it as an insight, and then you would discuss it with your legal advisors back at your agencies. Let's talk about the actual procurement standards now and what has changed. So procurement in the uniform guidance can be found in the post-award section, subpart D at 200.317 to 200.327. It used to end at 200.326, but there is a new procurement provision for Buy American. So 200.317, the first procurement provision, is specific to states. When procuring property or services with federal funds, states would follow the same policies and procedures it uses with non-federal funds. States also follow 200.321, 22, 23, and 27. All other non-federal entities follow 318 to 327. Now, procurement across the country is heavily governed by state regulation, which is why the states are kind of in a little category of their own when it comes to procurement. However, if you're a non-federal entity, you have an address, and your address, you reside in a state. In this case, everyone in this webinar has an address in the state of California. So in addition to following the uniform guidance, you would want to make sure that you are following the procurement requirements of the state of California as well. The non-federal entity 200.318. Now this is a long provision, and there are a lot of bullet points with this provision. So we have about 4 slides just for 200.318, which are considered general procurement standards. So non-federal entities must have your written procurement procedures, and it has to be consistent with state, local, tribal law, and the uniform guidance. The non-federal entity must maintain oversight, and that's kind of typical. Of course, you would maintain oversight and monitor the work. Non-federal entities must have written standards of conduct covering conflicts of interest with related parties, financial conflicts such as gratuities or favors, or organizational conflicts with affiliates. So if you're a big company, you might have affiliates that you would have to be consistent. So let's look at a couple of these conflict of interest with related parties. A lot of times you'll have a board of directors with your nonprofit, and someone on the board of directors has a brother-in-law who's an accountant. Well, let's hire Fred. Well, that's a conflict of interest because of the related parties. So conflict of interest is an important overall theme to watch out for. Gratuities can be a problem for the non-federal entities who conduct fundraising. So if you're an institution of higher ed and you have a big alumni office and you go out and get donations from your alumni, or you have capital campaigns, if you're a nonprofit and you have donors and you receive donations, you would not want any of the donations, which are part of your standard customary doing business, because that's the nature of your business, you would never want a donation to be confused with a gratuity violation. So it would be important, while you're also looking at your written procurement policy, to see if there needs to be approval. If you are a non-federal entity that has a fundraising arm of your business, you would want to have some stated policy that saying we accept donations as the nature of our business, so that they're not to be confused with a gratuity violation for a contract. Hey, pay me. If you hire me, I'll give you a good deal, kind of thing. You want to make sure that your fundraising activities are not confused with conflicts of interest for procurement. And then non-federal entities must avoid unnecessary or duplicative items. Yes, be cost effective, be thoughtful in what you're purchasing. Understand there might be economical options, such as leasing rather than purchasing, which might make more sense for you. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but to be aware of those options. The non-federal entity is encouraged to enter into state and local intergovernmental agreements for shared services. I know that when I worked in the field, I worked for a community college, and we were able to piggyback onto the county's procurement contract for lawn mowing, grass cutting, and snow removal. It was less expensive to order those services through the county's contract. Now, we still had to pay for it, but it was less expensive to enter into an intergovernmental agreement. And the states and counties will often have those available to their recipients. So the non-federal entity is encouraged to use federal excess and surplus property when feasible. And that's this. The federal government will have warehouses of older computer equipment, older cars, and sometimes you can get it for free by calling up one of the federal warehouses. The non-federal entity is encouraged to use value engineering clauses for a construction project. The non-federal entity must, that's a must, not an encouraged, award contracts only to responsible and qualified parties with consideration to risk, integrity, compliance, past performance, all that good stuff. You need to do risk assessments before entering into a contractual relationship with a contractor. Make sure they're not suspended or debarred. We're still on 318. The non-federal entity must maintain records to detail the history of the procurement. The non-federal entity may use a time and materials contract only after determination that no other contract type is suitable, and the contract includes a ceiling. So the uniform guidance would prefer cost reimbursement or fixed price contracts. They will accept a time and materials contract, but those are typically open-ended, and they want, if you use that kind of a contract, you must include a ceiling, like not to exceed such and such of dollars. And then the non-federal entity must be responsible to settle all claims and disputes. So there was a lot in the general procurement provisions. Competition is one of the provisions that gave non-federal entities a little bit of heartburn, because people got used, they're used to having the same CPA firm handle their indirect cost proposal, or their end of year close, or their indirect rate, and they want to hire the same CPA firm year after year after year. Or I know that when I was working with in institution of higher ed, and we got a research grant, my faculty member always wanted to purchase some fancy schmancy piece of equipment, as part of that research grant, and they would write it into the grant. We want to buy this Electron Nano atom smashing microscope, whatever, the flux capacitor, and it would be named in the proposal. And then when the proposal was awarded, they would go out and buy what they had wanted. And now that's considered unfair competitive advantage. And so this is why non-federal entities had a little bit of heartburn with these new procurement. What do you mean we can't write in what we want to buy in our proposal? So as part of this requirement, you need to eliminate unfair competitive advantage, and then you need to have it, depending on how much money it is at stake, at least price quotes, and because people really didn't like having to do these formal bid processes because they were difficult to do. Now, another thing we would do on the second bullet on this slide, when I worked for my institution of higher ed, we would call the manufacturer that the faculty member wanted, and we'd say, hey, we're submitting a grant to the National Science Foundation, for example, and if we're awarded, we're going to buy your super duper microscope. And the vendor would say, oh, that's great news. Here, let me give you this spec sheet. And you can include that in your proposal, so it's really, really clear this is exactly what you want. And so when you're awarded, you can buy it. Now, we used to do that all the time under the old OMB circulars, but under the uniform guidance, now you can't do it. As a matter of fact, if you enter into a conversation with a particular vendor and the vendor helps you, the contractor helps you develop the specifications or gives you details to include in your proposal, they are excluded from competing. Not only do you have to compete the procurement, but the contractor who helped you write it up is not going to be allowed to even compete. So that is a really big change from the way things used to be done under the old circulars. So requirements that are considered unfair include, and they list them, any unreasonable requirement, like you really want to hire, a contractor A, and you're going to have contractor B, C, and D, competing for the bid. So you write it up to specifically refer to contractor A, so none of the other contractors would qualify. So you can't do that anymore. You can't require unnecessary experience. You can't have non-competitive pricing practices between affiliated companies. This is the big one, non-competitive contracts to consultants on retainers. Well, we have them on retainers, so we just go back and use this particular consultant. And organizational conflicts of interest, related parties, specifying a brand name only is considered unfair, and any kind of arbitrary action when you want to hire a particular contractor, whatever you do, that you write it up so specific and so arbitrarily that nobody else would qualify, and that's considered a no-no under the 200-319. Non-federal entities must not pose a local geographic preferences. I used to work in a county that wanted us to first give preference to any business that was located in that county before we would hire someone else. That's not allowed anymore. No local geographic preference except where federal statutes apply or in architectural and engineering contracts, as long as there is an adequate number of qualified firms. Like, you're just not going to go back and hire the same firm over and over again. So there's a lot about competition. Here's yet another slide. So your written procedures for procurements must ensure clear and accurate description of the requirements, and it has to identify all the requirements, and all pre-qualified lists of contractors must be current and include enough qualified sources. So a lot of jurisdictions will have these pools of contractors that they like to use that they've pre-vetted. And that's okay to pre-qualify as long as you're not just pre-qualifying one person and then you go back to hire that one contractor. You have to have enough enough qualified sources so that you can say, yes, we've ensured free and open competition. 320 is all about different methods of procurement, and there have been some changes under 320 from the old uniform guidance to the new. So the non-federal entity must have and use documented procurement procedures consistent with the uniform guidance. And so there's again your written policies and procedures, and then they need to be consistent with the identified methods of procurement. So here are your options under 200-320, and they're divided into two categories as informal procurement methods and formal procurement methods, informal and formal. So the informal methods are defined under 200-320A. And informal methods of procurement include the micro purchase and small purchase, and they're generally simpler procurement methods than very expensive formal procurements. And this was kind of a compromise for all the complaints from the grant community about the uniform guidance and this free and open competition and this difficult bid process that made it just really difficult for a lot of non-federal entities who received grants. So this informal method, 200-320A, put a little star by that and make sure you look it up because that's a good method and it's easier to do. So what's new under this method? Well, first of all, the micro purchase used to be $3,500. It's now up to $10,000, which is what the FAR says. It's consistent with the FAR. So that made everybody happy because, gee, what could we, you can just go out and buy something. No procurement process, just go, you need it, go buy it. But there's not very much to buy for $3,500, a little bit better with $10,000. There's no required bid process, no required price quotes, you just go out and buy it. The requirement does say, please distribute your micro purchases equitably among qualified suppliers. Just don't constantly sole source it. And then the purchase cards or the P cards, if you have a non-federal entity that uses these types of purchasing, like little credit cards, may be used if the procedures are documented. So that was something that people, non-federal entities, always used to use under the old circulars, and it became more difficult to use them with the first iteration of the uniform guidance. Now with this new revision, you can use them again, but you have to have written procedures. A1 is the micro purchase, 200.320A1. Non-federal entities responsible to determine and document an appropriate micro purchase threshold. Now, the uniform guidance says $10,000. You can just start with 10,000, but it now gives you the option to identify a higher threshold, which would be very attractive to many non-federal entities. Oh, you mean we can have a micro purchase that's even bigger than $10,000? That means we can just go out and buy things and there is no procurement process? That sounds good to us. So you can go up to $50,000 now. If you have the written policies and procedures that say that your micro purchase is going to exceed the FAR recommended 10,000. Non-federal entities may self-certify on an annual basis and maintain documentation. Why do they need a micro purchase up to $50,000? But it is possible with proper documentation, and you would want your proper procurement specialists and your proper legal advisors to guide you how to set that up. Self-certification must contain a justification and documentation. Yes, I'm a low risk auditee, I'm not high risk, we have a good management plan, we conduct our risk assessments, we have our own internal institutional risk assessment, and we follow state law as appropriate. So this provision gives you the requirements for self-certification if you want to go up to $50,000. Now, you can increase the micro purchase over $50,000, which is really, tremendous considering that the version of the uniform guidance before this, the micro purchase was only $3,500. So this was a big compromise from the federal government for the non-federal entities. Now, if you want a micro purchase over $50,000, it has to be approved by the cognizant agency for indirect costs, and the increased threshold remains valid until there is a change in status affecting the approval. So there's quite a bit of leeway now with micro purchase under the newly revised uniform guidance, and there's the provision number 200.320A1. Now 200.320A2 is considered a small purchase. It's the next procurement level beyond a micro purchase. And this level used to be $150,000. Now it's $250,000. Well, there is an awful lot of things that you can purchase that cost $250,000 or less. And so it may not be necessary to go through a lot of this self-certification to raise the micro purchase, because anything that's above the micro purchase, whether it's a $10,000 micro purchase, a $50,000 micro purchase, or something greater than $50,000, anything that's above the micro purchase up to $250,000 is considered a small purchase. And once again, it's a much simpler procurement process. There's no bid process. You just have to get an adequate number of price quotes. How hard is that to go get price quotes? And then a lower threshold may be used when authorized and not prohibited by state or local law. But that's really quite remarkable. So there's less of a need to change the micro purchase, because anything up to 250, there's no bid, just price quotes. The FAR says adequate number. They will take 2 or more price quotes. In the grant community, traditionally, it's 3 price quotes. Easy. Now, the formal method of procurement starts with 200.320B. And the formal procurement methods include sealed bids and competitive bids. And this would be for procurements that exceed the simplified acquisition threshold. The small purchase threshold is another way to say that, which is currently set at $250,000. You still have to go through either sealed bids or a competitive bid process if you're purchasing something over $250,000. Sealed bids, there'd be a public solicitation for a firm. They generally want a fixed price contract, and lowest price generally gets the bid. So the contract goes to the lowest price. It's the preferred method for construction contracts. There are different specifications that are defined in the provision language. 2 or more bidders are considered an adequate number. And then the selection is solely based on best price. whoever came in with the best price. 200-320B2 has to do with competitive bids. And again, there'd be a public solicitation for a firm fixed price or cost reimbursement contract, must be a written method for review and selection, 2 or more bidders. The selection this is the interesting thing here. You are not stuck with the best price. If you have a bidder and the bidder has better quality than the low bidder, the higher bidder has better quality than the lower bidder, and you want to go with the better quality, you can do that under this type of competitive bid. It can be best value. So what is most advantageous? Now, if price is still considered, but you can consider other factors too, like best value, or maybe the guy with the lowest price is out of stock and it's on back order for 6 months or 8 months, where the next person up is available right away. So you can go with best value or what's most advantageous with the competitive bids now, and they can also be used with architectural and engineering contracts. So 200-320C is a non-competitive contract, and this would be your sole source. It can only be used in specific circumstances. They can only be awarded when one or more of the following apply. So it does not exceed the micro purchase threshold. Yeah, you can just go buy something without price quotes under micro purchase. Then you have 4 more options. There's only one company that makes it. So of course it's going to be single source. There are no options. Or it might be a public emergency, and there's been a hurricane, and all the electricity is off and there's flooding in the streets, and you've got to get the electricity turned on and you've got to get all the debris removed. So a public emergency will not permit a delay resulting from a bid process. You can just go out and purchase. The third one, let's skip for a moment. Or let's say the fourth one, you've put out a solicitation, but you didn't get an adequate number of bidders. And that happens a lot if you're in a rural area and there are not a lot of options for contractors. Then you can go ahead and award to the one who applied. Now, the third one that I skipped, for the one next to the bottom, the federal agency or pass-through entity approves it. So awarding agencies, and including pass-through entities, if a subrecipient approaches you and says, we'd like to purchase this as a sole source, like we want to hire this person named in the proposal, and without going out for hiring, can we do that? We want to purchase this particular fire truck or this particular microscope or whatever it is. Can we do that? The awarding agency, if they approve it, then you can have a sole source. But there needs to be justification in writing. Small, meeby-weebies, minority business enterprises and women's business enterprises or labor surplus, you're encouraged to use them when possible. And then just to place these firms on a solicitation list so you're sure to include them. Sometimes if you have a great big procurement that you know the small business can't do, you can divide the requirement into smaller tasks to permit these types of firms to participate. So this is an must use when possible. So it's not a must all the time. You're encouraged to use the small and minority business enterprises. Here's the new one, the domestic preference from the Buy American Act. There is a preference to purchase goods or services produced in the United States, and that's basically it. So, even the computers, though it's a little hard, your American brand computers may have Chinese chips inside of them. Recovered materials is, are you using recycled paper and recycled toner, things like that. And there's the reference to the federal acts and the EPA guidelines. If whenever you can, please purchase items that contain recovered materials. And this applies to items over $10,000. So contract cost and price. This is for large procurements over the $250,000 price range. If you're going out for bid, you have to perform a cost and price analysis. That way, if you're getting the best price or going with best value, you're able to justify whichever way you go. And then you must negotiate price as a separate element as opposed to profit. Cost estimates are allowable only to the extent that costs or estimates included in negotiated prices would be allowable under subpart E. That's the cost principles of the uniform guidance. And of course, they don't want these cost plus percentage of costs contracts that were allowable under the old circulars. They don't want them used. Federal or pass-through review under 200.325. Non-federal entities can self-certify that they have a good procurement process, or they can have the federal agency or the pass-through entity review their procurement policies and procedures to make sure that they're appropriate. 326 is specific to construction contracts. Federal or pass-through entities must accept bonding policies of a non-federal entity if the federal interest is adequately protected. So bonding is a type of insurance in the construction business. Basically, if the building collapses or if they don't ever complete the construction, you have this, if it's bonded, then the federal government and the pass-through, the awarding agencies don't lose the money, they're protected. And there are different kinds of requirements, but that is defined all in 200.326. And then the last procurement provision is the contract provisions. You need to incorporate national policy requirements into your contract agreement. And Appendix 2 of the Uniform Guidance provides you with a list of a lot of these national policy requirements, like, you must comply with the Drug-Free Workplace Act, the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, Buy American Act. You must not be suspended or debarred, and there's about a list of 24 of them in Appendix 2. So now what are some of the common challenges to finish up the presentation? What gives people problems? So first of all, updating your procurement policy and procedures is just extremely important, particularly with all the changes with the methods of procurement and the different thresholds. You need to have, whether you want your contractors to follow the FAR or to follow the uniform guidance if it's under a grant. How are you going to handle hiring staff named in proposals? Does your HR policy allow you to do that? So you would want to make sure that you have consistency within your organization that says, yes, if you get the permission from the federal granting agency or the pass-through granting agency that you can hire the person who's named in the proposal, then make sure you have that written down somewhere that that's your preferred method, and that it follows the, it's allowable under the hiring processes, policies of your organization. And again, if you want sole source or non-competitive, again, we'll talk, the next couple slides talk about these in more detail, but how do you handle a sole source or non-competitive? What about your pre-award risk assessments? What about the cost principles, and then the different contract types? So let's look at the next few pages. So again, as we said, it's really important that you update your written policy and procedures for your procurement, how you handle procurement, and to make sure that you're aligned with the revised uniform guidance. Incorporate the new information, revise the existing information, and remove anything that's outdated. For individuals or firms named in proposals, again, you have to be mindful of the requirement for free and open competition. So are you allowed to hire the person named in your proposal? Is it HR? Does HR allow you, or does something have to go out for bid? Does the position have to be advertised and applicants come in for an interview and the best applicant is selected? You need to make sure that hiring under the procurement contracts are consistent with the HR policies. And then anything that you want to sole source, make sure that you have your awarding agency approval for it. And then if you have consultants or firms on retainer, let's say you have the same CPA and you just want to use the same CPA year after year to help you with your indirect cost rate proposal or your single audit or your whatever your end of year or close, then you would probably, and again, I can't give you legal advice, but one best practice is to keep the retainer, but to make it applicable for a period of 3 years or 5 years. And then at the end of that renewal period, where you can still renew the person who's on retainer each fiscal year, then you have to go out to full bid every 5 years or every 3 years. And that's one best practice that people use when they have an established business relationship and they want to use the same contractor year after year. So check with your legal advisors and your procurement advisors with your organization for additional guidance on that. And then for sole source, non-competitive procurements, know what the allowable circumstances are, and there they are again. And make sure you have awarding agency approval for that sole source. I would do it no matter what. The uniform guidance defines different types of contracts. They prefer fixed price and cost reimbursement, and you'll see that throughout the language. And time and materials is permissible if you are under certain circumstances. Cost plus a fee, a profit fee, is okay if the fee is separated from the actual cost. And then cost plus percentage and percentage of construction costs are prohibited. So again, don't forget about conflicts of interest. No, you can't hire the accountant who's your board member's brother-in-law. Make sure you're hiring someone who's not suspended or debarred, that you've done your risk assessments, that you are awarding to responsible parties, and you're going to look at their past performance, and you're going to make their stated deliverables so that you can check off that they've delivered what they were supposed to do. Make sure that you select the applicable guidance. Do you want your contractors to follow the uniform guidance, the FAR? What are the cost principles? And then define it in your award agreements. So in summary, contracts with grants are generally for procurement. The procurement standards have been revised in this new version of the uniform guidance. You absolutely need to have written procedures, and they need to be revised to align with the new requirements. And then your contract agreement should identify the type of contract. This is a fixed price contract. This is a cost reimbursement contract. You're going to follow the uniform guidance, not the FAR, and you're going to follow the uniform guidance cost principles, not the FAR cost principles. And this will be a small purchase or a micro purchase. purchase, or this is a sealed bid, competitive bid, whatever the method of procurement is, and make sure the deliverables are clearly defined. And with that, Amy, that brings us to Q&A. Do we have any
Great.
questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Karen. Let me take a look here and okay. So I don't see any questions here. So if anyone does have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A tab and we'll try to get to those. Couple reminders, we are recording today's webinar that is going to be available on the OPR YouTube page, and there'll be a link to that recording on the OPR Federal Grant Resources page under events and trainings. And so the slides for today's presentation are already up there on that page. You can go and check those out. I'd also like to invite everyone to attend our next webinar that we are going to be holding June 23rd, called Updating Policies and Procedures, which you've heard a little bit about today as well. So we will be having that session June 23rd. The registration for that you can find on the OPR website as well. Under the announcements page, we have a link for those upcoming webinars as well. Okay,
Great.
so here I do see one question here for Karen. Karen, do we need to do subcontracting plans over 700,000?
The 700,000 is not a federal threshold that I am familiar with. Now, that may be a threshold that's within the state of California, but the terminology just either a grant award or a contract award. So depending upon what you mean by subcontracting, if you mean that you want the recipient, the subrecipient, to deliver part of the grant award, that would be a subaward, not a subcontract. If you have a big procurement, then you would contract with the contractor who would deliver if you're ordering fire trucks or furniture or copier paper or toner. If one contractor can't deliver everything under the contract, it is possible to have a subcontract, but usually under these new provisions, subcontracts aren't used quite that way. There could be a separate contract delivered. So you would want to take that question to your legal advisors. I'm sorry, it's not a definitive answer, but I'm not familiar with the 700,000, and I'm not sure how you're using the term subcontract. If you want them to deliver part of the program, then that would be a subaward, not a subcontract. If it's strictly a procurement where you're purchasing something, then that's a contract. Hopefully that helps give you some insights that you can go back and discuss with your grant teams. While we're waiting to see if anybody else has a question, I'm going to advance the slides a little bit. I just want to remind you that what we're providing, it's not advancing. There we go. Just remember that I can't give you legal advice or financial advice. Please check with your legal or financial advisors back at your institution or at your non-federal entity. However, I sincerely hope that the information that we provided for you today provides you with some insights as you further pursue your work. And then for those of you who may think of a question after the fact, come on, slides. There we go. Here is the contact for Amy. If you want to contact Amy Miller at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, there's their website and Amy's email address. And thanks, Amy. And there is my contact information. If you think of a question afterwards, you can email me.
So Karen, we do have one more question that came up. Is there a date when we would need to have our policies updated?
It should be updated as soon as you can get it done. The proposed guidance was announced in January, and then it was finalized in August of last year. And the effective date in the final rule was November 12th, 2020. So the revised uniform guidance is now in effect. So as soon as you can get those policies updated, the better. And certainly if you can get it done, you're approaching the end of a fiscal year. If you can get it done as close to that as possible, that would be beneficial.
Okay, I don't see any other questions for Karen in the questions tab. So I think with that, we will close this session. And again, thank you everyone for coming here. I think we will be sending out a follow-up survey request if you want to answer just a quick 3-question survey to let us know how you like this webinar. And it also gives you a chance to put in any ideas that you have for some future trainings for us, which we'd love to hear about. So with that, thank you, Karen. And we'll
You're
see you next
welcome.
time.
Great. Bye, everyone, and thanks for attending.